The depot smelled like diesel and cut grass, the way it always did at 3:47 in the afternoon, when the buses lined up along the fence like yellow dominoes waiting to be knocked down. I was sitting on the cinder block wall outside the maintenance bay, eating a ham sandwich Twyla Rensink had packed for me that morning because she said I looked thin, when I saw Bus 19 come around the bend on Trotter Road, doing maybe 50 in a 35 zone. My name is Colton Braye. I've driven Bus 12 for the Harmon Consolidated School District for 11 years. Before that, I drove a bread truck. Before that, I stocked shelves at a farm supply. I'm not a hero. I'm not a leader. I'm a man who shows up, does the route, and goes home. That's the whole of it. Bus 19 wasn't mine. Bus 19 belonged to Griff Paulak, a quiet, barrel-shaped man who'd been driving routes since before I got hired. Griff was meticulous. Griff never ran hot. Griff stopped at every railroad crossing and opened the door and listened even though the nearest active rail line was 40 miles east. So when I saw his bus barreling toward the depot like it had somewhere terrible to be, I set down my sandwich and stood. The bus came through the gate without slowing, clipped the chain-link post, and fishtailed across the gravel lot. I could hear the engine screaming. Griff had it floored in second gear, the transmission winding up like a wounded animal. The bus slewed sideways and stopped at an angle across 3 parking lines, dust billowing up in a copper cloud that turned the late sun the color of a bruise. Nobody got off. I waited. The other drivers, Marlene in Bus 6, old Deacon Sut in Bus 3, the new kid whose name I hadn't learned yet in Bus 8. They were all standing now, watching the same thing I was watching. A yellow school bus, windows intact, emergency flashers not activated, engine still running, sitting in the middle of the depot lot with its door closed and its interior dark. Griff's route covered the north corridor. 23 children, 12 stops. The elementary kids at Linden Creek, the middle schoolers along Doss Farm Road, and the 4 high school athletes who got picked up last from the practice fields behind Harmon Secondary. 23 children every afternoon. Same order, same faces, same sticky fingerprints on the same green vinyl seats. I knew this because Griff and I had compared routes once over coffee, and he'd recited every child's name from memory like a rosary. I walked toward the bus. The gravel crunched under my boots, and I remember thinking how loud it was. How the afternoon had gone quiet, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something that can't be unsaid. No birds. No highway noise from the bypass. Just my boots and the diesel idle of Bus 19's engine ticking like a mechanical heartbeat. I reached the door and knocked on the glass. Griff? Nothing. I hit the emergency release on the exterior panel. Every driver knows where it is. A black lever recessed behind a spring-loaded cover just below the windshield line, and the bifold door hissed open. The smell hit me first. Not rot, not yet. Something sharper. Copper and sweat and something astringent underneath, like a hospital floor mopped with the wrong chemical. The seats were empty. Every single one. 23 children's worth of nothing. Backpacks gone, lunchboxes gone, jackets gone. The bus was clean. Not just empty clean, the way a place is clean when someone has removed evidence rather than just left. But the driver's seat was wet. A dark stain had soaked through the gray fabric and pooled on the rubber floor mat beneath the pedals. Griff's thermos, a dented steel thing he'd carried for a decade, sat upright in the cup holder, lid still screwed on, as if he'd placed it there carefully before whatever happened next. I pulled back out of the bus and looked at Marlene, who'd come up behind me with her hand over her mouth. "Where's Griff?" she said. "He's not in there." "The children, not in there either." Deacon Sutt had his phone out. He was dialing 911 and getting nothing. I could see the no service icon from 8 feet away. He shook the phone like that might fix the tower. The new kid in bus 8 hadn't moved from beside his vehicle. He was 19, maybe 20, and he was staring at bus 19 the way you stare at a door you know you shouldn't open. Then the screaming started. From inside the bus, from the back, behind the rear emergency door, where the engine compartment meets the luggage bay, a space no child should be able to fit into and no adult would choose to enter. A sound so wrong, so fundamentally not a sound a human throat should make, that Marlene grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises I'd still have 3 days later. I didn't run. I want that on the record. I didn't run toward the screaming, and I didn't run away from it. I stood there, rooted in 11 years of routine, and I thought, that is not Griff's voice. That is not a child. That is something using a throat the way a fist uses a glove. And still I walked toward it, because the bus was in my depot, and the depot was my responsibility. And routine was the only language I had ever spoken fluently. The rear emergency door of a Bluebird All-American school bus is held shut by a latch rated for 40 pounds of force. I know this because I'd replaced the latch on bus 12 twice, once after a kid kicked it open on a dare. Once after a rear-end collision on Route 9 that buckled the frame just enough to pop the seal. 40 pounds. A grown man can defeat it with one hand. A child can defeat it with both. Whatever was behind that door was hitting it with considerably more than 40 pounds. The metal bowed outward with each impact, not rhythmically, not like someone pounding with intention, but in irregular, convulsive bursts. As if the thing hitting the door didn't understand the concept of a door, but understood very well the concept of getting out. Colton, don't. Marlene had let go of my arm. She was backing toward bus 6, her keys already in her hand. And I noticed she'd shifted her weight to the balls of her feet, like a woman who had already decided to run and was only waiting for permission. We should wait for who? I said. The phone towers were down. Deacon was still shaking his cell like a man trying to get ketchup from a bottle. The depot landline was inside the maintenance bay, and the maintenance bay was locked because Hector, our mechanic, had gone home at 2 with a stomach flu that had been running through town for a week. A stomach flu that started with a fever and ended with what, exactly? I hadn't asked. Nobody had asked. You don't ask about a stomach flu because it's a stomach flu. And then one day, you realize you should have asked. The screaming changed. It dropped in pitch, became guttural, wet, and then it wasn't screaming anymore. It was something between a moan and a gargle, and it was accompanied by a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on sheet metal, that made my back teeth ache. I'm going to open it, I said. Why? Marlene's voice was high and thin. I didn't have an answer that would make sense to her. The truth was simpler than reason. Bus 19 came back to my depot. The depot is where the children come from and return to. If there was even a chance one of those 23 kids was trapped in that luggage bay, then I was going to open the door, because that's what the depot man does. He accounts for the children, every head, every name, every stop. I reached the rear of the bus. The emergency door had a T-handle latch on the outside standard retrofit for maintenance access. I wrapped my hand around it. The metal was warm from the sun, and beneath my palm, I could feel the vibration of whatever was inside. A tremor transmitted through steel and rubber that felt alive, in a way that steel and rubber should not feel. I turned the handle and pulled. The door swung open, and Griff Pollack fell out. He landed on the gravel at my feet, face down, and for one full second, I thought he was dead. His uniform shirt, the same khaki button-down the district issued to all of us, was torn open across the back, and the skin beneath was mottled with bruises so dark they looked painted on. His right hand was a ruin. The fingernails were gone, shredded down to the quick, and the tips of his fingers were abraded to raw meat. That was the scraping sound. That was Griff, trying to claw his way out of his own bus. Then he moved. He pushed up onto his hands and knees, and his head lifted, and I saw his face, and my body understood what my mind refused to process. His eyes were wrong. Not the color. Griff had brown eyes, and they were still brown. The wrongness was in the mechanism. His pupils were blown wide, so dilated that the iris was just a thin ring. And they didn't track. They didn't focus. They moved in small, rapid jerks, scanning without seeing, the way a motion sensor sweeps a room. His mouth opened, and the sound came out again, that gargling moan. And I saw that his gums were bleeding. Not from injury, from pressure. The blood was welling up from around his teeth as if something inside his mouth was swelling, pushing outward, making room for a function his jaw was never designed to perform. I stumbled backward. My heel caught the curb, and I sat down hard on the asphalt. Griff, the thing that had been Griff, got to its feet in a motion that was too fast and too fluid for a man who'd just fallen 3 feet onto gravel. It stood the way a puppet stands when someone jerks the strings taut all at once, sudden, wrong, upright. It looked at me. I say looked, but what I mean is that its face turned toward me, and the scanning eyes found the thing that was moving, and the thing that was moving was me. Deacon Sutt shouted something. I don't remember what. I remember the new kid, Bus 8, 19 years old, name I never learned. I remember him starting his engine. And I remember Marlene already in Bus 6 with her door locked. And I remember the extraordinary clarity of the thought that passed through my mind like a telegram from a calmer version of myself. He drove the route. He picked up 23 children. He came back alone. Where are the children? Griff lunged. Not at me, at the sound. Deacon had shouted, and Griff's ruined body redirected mid-stride, pivoting toward the louder stimulus with the mechanical efficiency of a thing that no longer bothered with choice. Deacon saw it coming. Deacon was 71 years old and had driven Bus 3 for 15 years, and he dropped his useless phone and ran for the maintenance bay door with more speed than I'd ever seen from him. I got up. I got in Bus 12. I started the engine. And I pulled out of the depot, not toward home, not toward safety, but north onto Trotter Road, toward the first stop on Griff's route, because 23 children were out there, somewhere between here and Harmon Secondary. And the only map I had was the route itself. The sun was 40 minutes from the horizon. The road ahead was empty. And in my mirror, I watched Griff Pollack catch Deacon Sutt at the fence line. And I kept driving because stopping would not save Deacon, and turning around would not bring back what Griff had been. The route was all I had. So I drove. Griff's first stop was the corner of Doss Farm Road and Milner Lane, 3 miles north of the depot. I knew this from our coffee conversation, and I knew it from the laminated route card that every driver kept clipped to the visor. Griff's would be on Bus 19 back at the depot. But I'd seen it enough times to reconstruct the first 6 stops from memory. After that, I'd be guessing. After that, the route would become a country I'd only heard described. The drive took 4 minutes at the speed I was doing, which was too fast for a school bus on a 2-lane road, but too slow for the feeling in my chest. The late sun was painting everything in that amber light that makes the ordinary world look like a photograph of itself, the kind of light that says evening, says ending, says whatever you're going to do it before dark, Doss Farm Road was a residential stretch. Maybe a dozen houses spread along a quarter-mile of cracked asphalt, lined with mailboxes and drainage ditches. Griff picked up 6 children here. I remembered that number because he'd complained once that 6 was too many for one stop, that the parents should stagger their kids to at least 2 pickup points. And I'd agreed because agreeing with Griff was easy and disagreeing with him required energy I'd never had. I pulled bus 12 to the shoulder and opened the door. The neighborhood was quiet. Not empty, I could see a sprinkler running in one yard, a garage door open on another, a tricycle overturned on a driveway, but quiet in the way that meant the people who made the noise were somewhere else now. "Hello?" I called it from the bus steps, one hand on the rail, one foot on the ground. My voice sounded foolish. A bus driver calling into a suburban street at 4:15 in the afternoon, like he'd lost a package. "Anyone here? I'm looking for the kids from the bus route, Griff Pollack's route." A screen door opened 3 houses down. A woman stepped onto her porch holding a cordless phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. And the combination of those 2 objects told me everything I needed to know about what kind of afternoon she was having. She was mid-40s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a nurse's scrub top over jeans. And she was looking at me with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information and is afraid this is it. "Are you with the school?" she called. "I drive bus 12, the other route." Griff's bus came back to the depot empty. The woman's face did something complicated. "Cale didn't come home," she said. "My son, Cale Dunnigan. He's on that bus. He's always on that bus. Griff honks twice, and Cale runs out, and—" She stopped because her voice had reached a frequency that wouldn't carry words anymore. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and stood at the edge of her driveway with the knife still in her hand. And I realized she hadn't brought it for me. She'd brought it because she'd seen something before I arrived that made a kitchen knife seem reasonable. "Ma'am, Mrs. Dunnigan." "Patrice." "Patrice, what happened here today?" She pointed with the knife north, up Doss Farm Road, toward the bend where it curved into the tree line. "The Hartzell boy," she said, "from the brick house at the end. He came home from school early, sick. His mother said he had a fever. She said she was taking him to urgent care. That was noon." She paused. "At 2 o'clock, Mrs. Hartzell came out of her house and walked into the Costas' yard and attacked their dog. Not like a person attacks, like a machine. She didn't stop when it was done. She walked to the next yard. Mr. Costa came out with a garden hoe and she—" Patrice closed her eyes. "I locked my doors. I called 911 and got nothing. The bus never came. And now you're telling me the bus came back empty." I looked up the road toward the tree line. The shadows were longer now. The amber light was deepening toward copper. "How many are still here?" I asked. "How many families on this block?" "The Gatterdams. Shiloh is 7. She rides Griff's bus. Her mother locked them inside when Mrs. Hartzell when it started. The Costas left. The Milners left. Everyone else I don't know. I haven't looked. I've been standing at my window with this knife waiting for a bus that didn't come. And now you're here in the wrong bus and my son is not with you. I'm going to find him." The words came out before I could weigh them. I didn't know why I said it. I didn't know how I'd do it. The route was 23 children long, and the sun was 35 minutes from gone, and I was a man whose greatest professional skill was arriving on time. But Patrice Dunnigan looked at me with those devastated eyes, and I said it because the alternative was saying nothing. And nothing was a kind of abandonment I couldn't stomach. "The Gatterdam girl," I said. "Can you get to their house? Can you bring Shiloh here?" "I'm not leaving without Cale." "I will find Cale. but Shiloh needs to be on this bus when I come back through." Patrice stared at me. Then she nodded once, hard, the way people nod when they are choosing to believe something that has not yet earned belief. I pulled the door shut and drove north toward the bend in the road. And in my mirror, I watched Patrice Dunnigan cross the street toward the Gatterdam house, knife in hand, moving with the purposeful stride of a mother whose child was missing, and whose patience had become something sharper than grief. The Hartzell house sat at the end of Doss Farm Road, where the pavement surrendered to gravel, and the gravel surrendered to a dirt track that disappeared into the Becker Creek tree line. Brick ranch, black shutters, an American flag on the porch that hung limp in the windless air. The front door was open, not ajar, fully open. The way a door is open when leaving was more important than security, when the person going through it had already stopped being a person who closes doors. I didn't go inside. There was nothing in there for me, and I knew it the way you know a room is cold before you enter it. A premonition carried by the quality of the air, the stillness, the absence of the small sounds that mean life. A coffee maker ticking, a television murmuring, a refrigerator humming. The Hartzell house was making none of those sounds. It was making the sound of an open building cooling in the late afternoon, and that was all. What I did see was the dog. What remained of the Costas' dog was on the lawn between the two properties, and I'm not going to describe it, because describing it would make it about the violence, and this isn't about the violence. This is about what comes after the violence. The quiet that settles like ash, the recalibration of what you thought the world was versus what the world has revealed itself to be. I drove past the Hartzell house and followed the dirt track into the tree line. Griff's route didn't come this way. His next stop after Doss Farm was a mile east on Schaefer Pike. But something Patrice said had snagged in my mind. The Hartzell boy came home early, sick. If the infection moved that fast, noon to 2 o'clock, fever to whatever Mrs. Hartzell became, then the bus route itself was a distribution system. Griff was picking up children, some of whom might already have been symptomatic, and sealing them in a metal tube for 35 minutes. The bus wasn't a rescue vehicle. The bus was an incubator. I stopped at the edge of the tree line and sat with the engine idling and my hands on the wheel and my forehead pressed against my knuckles. And I tried to think clearly about what that meant for the 23 children Griff had collected. It meant some of them might have turned on the bus. It meant Griff might have been dealing with an outbreak inside his own vehicle. 60 feet of chaos at 40 miles an hour. And the empty bus wasn't evidence of a kidnapping or an attack, it was evidence of an evacuation. Griff dumped the kids. Somewhere between the first stop and the depot, Griff recognized what was happening, and he pulled over, and he opened the doors, and he let them out, because the alternative was transporting infected children into the center of town. But where? 23 children don't vanish. Even scattered, even panicked, they leave evidence. Backpacks, shoes, a dropped phone. I'd driven from the depot to Doss Farm, and I'd seen nothing on the road, no debris, no sign of a sudden stop, no skid marks. If Griff evacuated the bus, he did it off the main road. He pulled onto a side street or a lot or a field, and he opened the doors, and he let 23 children pour into whatever was waiting for them. I turned bus 12 around and headed east toward Schaefer Pike, toward Griff's second stop, running the route in reverse, because reverse was the only direction that made sense. I was driving away from the depot, deeper into the route, backtracking Griff's last known path. Somewhere between his final pickup at Harmon Secondary and his return to the depot, the bus had become empty. The emptying point was the answer. Everything else was geography. Schaefer Pike was a long, flat stretch of county road bordered by soybean fields that ran to the horizon in every direction. The light out here was different, lower, more orange, more insistent. The sun was a fist-sized circle sitting on the tree line to the west, and the shadows of the power poles stretched across the road like the bars of a cage lying on its side. Griff's second stop was at the intersection of Schaefer and County Line 4, outside a small brick church with a gravel parking lot. Two families used this stop, the Varnells and the Hamuts. Breck Varnell was 14, a freshman who played JV soccer and carried a backpack so heavy it made him list to one side like a boat taking on water. Nor Hamud was 12, quiet, always reading, always the last one off the bus because she wanted to finish her page. I knew their names because Griff had told me their names. Griff knew every child on his route the way a shepherd knows every sheep, not as a number, but as a particular creature with particular habits. And he would talk about them with a tenderness that always surprised me, coming from a man built like a cinder block. The church parking lot was empty. No cars, no people. The church itself was locked. I could see the padlock on the front door from the bus. But on the gravel, near the road, there was a backpack. Purple, with a keychain dangling from the zipper, pull a small enamel pin in the shape of an open book. Nor Hammett's backpack. I'd seen her carry it 100 times when our routes overlapped at the depot. I picked it up. It was heavy with textbooks and a water bottle and a bag of almonds and a library book with a receipt sticking out of it marking page 204. The backpack of a girl who expected to come back for it. The backpack of a girl who set it down because something made her move faster than the backpack allowed. Nor had been here. She'd gotten off the bus or been let off the bus at her regular stop. And then she'd left without her bag, in a direction I couldn't determine, for a reason I could only dread. I put the backpack on Bus 12's front seat and drove on. Deeper into the route, deeper into the orange light. Deeper into the narrowing corridor between what I knew and what was waiting to be known. The third stop on Griff's route was the one I knew least about. A cluster of 4 houses on Jessamine Road, where the landscape shifted from open farmland to the wooded ravines that fed Becker Creek. The road here was narrow, canopied by oaks, and the light filtered through the branches and broken patterns that made everything look like it was moving, even when it was still. I came around a curve and had to brake hard. A minivan sat crosswise in the road, both front doors open, engine off. The windshield was intact, but the interior was chaos. A car seat overturned, a takeout bag spilled across the dashboard. A phone face down on the passenger seat, with its screen still glowing. Whoever had been in this van had left in 2 different directions, at 2 different speeds. I squeezed Bus 12 past the van with 6 inches to spare, scraping a branch along the passenger side that shrieked against the metal like a fingernail on a chalkboard. On the other side of the obstruction, the road opened into a straightaway. And at the end of the straightaway, I saw what I'd been looking for. Children. 4 of them, standing in the road near a driveway entrance, clustered together in that specific geometry of children who are scared and don't know who's in charge. They saw the bus, and they froze. And I saw the calculation happen in their bodies. Run or stay, trust or flee. And I realized they were trying to determine if the yellow bus coming toward them was rescue or just another wrong thing in an afternoon full of wrong things. I slowed to a crawl and opened the door while still rolling. Hey, it's okay. I'm Mr. Braye. I drive Bus 12. I'm from the depot. The tallest of the 4, a boy maybe 13, dark hair, lacrosse jersey, took a half step forward. Where's Mr. Pollack? Griff can't drive right now. I'm here instead. What are your names? The boy looked at the others. A girl, maybe 10, was gripping the strap of a lunchbox with both hands so tightly her knuckles were white. A younger boy, 7 or 8, was crying without making any sound. Just tears running down a face that had gone completely still, as if his body was grieving, but his mind had locked the volume. The 4th was a girl I recognized. Shiloh Gatterdam, small for her age, blonde braids, the same Shiloh I'd sent Patrice Donegan to retrieve from Doss Farm Road. Except Shiloh was here, 3 miles from home, standing in the road on Jessamine. Shiloh? I stepped off the bus. How did you get here? She looked at me with the flat, exhausted expression of a child who has walked farther than a 7-year-old should walk in one afternoon. Mr. Pollack let us off. He said to stay together. He said someone would come. He let you off here? On Jessamine? No. The older boy spoke. His name, I'd learn later, was Breck Varnell, the same Breck whose stop was back at the church on Schaefer Pike. He let us off on the highway, at the quick stop. He said to go inside and lock the door and wait. But the quick stop was... He stopped. His jaw worked. There were people inside already. Not regular people. Shiloh said we should walk. So we walked. Shiloh said they should walk. A 7-year-old girl whose bus driver had deposited her at a gas station that was already compromised. And she'd looked at the situation and made a command decision and led 3 other children 2 miles down a back road to the nearest cluster of houses. I looked at her braids coming loose, sneakers muddy, lunchbox strap chafing a red line across her palm. And I understood that leadership doesn't announce itself. It just walks in the direction that isn't death and trusts that others will follow. How many were on the bus when Griff let you off? I asked. A lot, Shiloh said. Maybe 15. But some of them were sick. Cale was sick. I went cold. Cale Donegan? He was sitting in the back and he was shaking, like his whole body, and his nose was bleeding. Mr. Pollack saw it in the mirror. And that's when he pulled over. He opened the doors and set everybody off. And he carried Cale to the gas station himself. He carried him inside. Griff had quarantined the sick child. Griff had done exactly what a man like Griff would do. He'd separated the healthy from the ill. He'd carried the weakest to shelter. And he'd driven the empty bus back to the depot to raise the alarm. Except somewhere between the quick stop and the depot, Griff himself had turned. The blood on the seat, the blown pupils, the ruined fingers, Griff had been symptomatic for the entire drive back. And he'd made it anyway, because Griff completed his route. Always. Without exception. Everybody on the bus, I said. Now. Breck helped the younger kids up the steps. I did a head count 4, including Shiloh, and I pulled the door shut and sat in the driver's seat and looked at the sun. It was resting on the treetops now, half hidden, leaking red light across the sky like a wound that wouldn't close. The quick stop on the highway was 6 miles southeast. 15 children minus 4 was 11 still out there. Plus Cale Donegan inside the gas station. Plus whoever had been in the quick stop when Griff arrived. The math wasn't complicated. The math was terrible. I turned bus 12 around and drove toward the highway. And behind me, Shiloh Gatterdam sat in the first seat, the seat closest to the driver. The seat children choose when they want to believe the adult at the wheel knows where he's going. The quick stop was on Route 71, a 2-lane state highway that connected Harmon to the county seat 20 miles south. It was the kind of gas station that sold bait and cold sandwiches and had a single bathroom with a key attached to a wooden paddle. And it sat alone at a crossroads with nothing around it but soybean fields and a cell tower that apparently wasn't working because my phone still showed no signal. and the radio in bus 12 was producing nothing but static on every channel. I parked the bus at the far edge of the lot, nose out, engine running. Through the windshield, I could see the Quick Stop's front windows, plate glass, covered in beer posters and lottery advertisements, and the front door, which was closed. The neon open sign was off. The gas pumps were unattended. 2 cars sat in the lot, a red pickup and a white sedan with a child's booster seat visible in the back. "Stay on the bus," I told the 4 children. "Breck, can you drive?" He blinked. "I'm 14. "Can you reach the pedals and steer?" Yeah, I think so." "If something comes out of that building that isn't me and isn't a child, you put this bus in drive and you go. South on 71. Don't stop until you find someone official. A police car, a fire station, a hospital, anyone with a uniform." "Mr. Braye?" "Breck, can you do it?" He nodded. He sat in the driver's seat and wrapped his hands around the wheel, and he looked so young and so determined that my throat closed for a moment, and I had to turn away before he saw my face do whatever it was doing. I got off the bus and crossed the parking lot. The asphalt was warm through my boot soles. The air was still. I could smell gasoline from the pumps and something else, something sweet and wrong, like fruit left too long in a closed car. The front door was locked. I cupped my hands against the glass and looked inside. The overhead fluorescents were on, buzzing with that particular frequency that makes every gas station feel like a liminal space even on a normal day. I could see the counter, the register, the candy rack, the coffee station with its thermal carafes. And on the floor, between the snack aisle and the cooler section, I could see bodies. 4. Lying in positions that suggested falling, rather than lying down limbs at odd angles. Torsos twisted. One face up with eyes open and mouth agape in an expression that was either agony or something beyond agony, something the face hadn't been designed to express. I moved to the side of the building. The bathroom door was closed. The dumpster enclosure was empty. The back entrance, a steel fire door with a push bar, was slightly ajar, propped open with a cinder block. And from inside, I could hear something I hadn't expected. Voices. Small voices. Children's voices, speaking in whispers so careful and deliberate that they sounded like a language being invented in real time. I pushed the door open slowly. The back room of the Quick Stop was a storage area. Shelving units stacked with inventory, a mop bucket in the corner, a desk with a computer that was still running. And beneath the desk, wedged into the knee-hole space with their knees drawn up and their backs against the wall, were 6 children. They looked at me with eyes that had aged 10 years in an afternoon. "My name is Colton Braye," I said, keeping my voice at the same volume as theirs, library volume, prayer volume, the volume of people who have learned that noise is currency and they are bankrupt. "I drive the school bus. I'm here to take you home." A girl in the front of the cluster, 11, maybe 12, with a scraped elbow and dirt on her forehead, shook her head. "You can't take us home. Home is where the sick people are." "Then I'll take you somewhere safe." "Where is that?" I didn't have an answer. The depot was compromised. Griff was there, and Griff was no longer Griff. The school was 5 miles in the wrong direction. The police, the fire department, the hospital. All of them required a phone that worked, or a drive toward town, which was toward population density, which was toward more of whatever was turning people into the thing Griff had become. "Where's Cale?" I asked instead. "Cale Donegan. He was brought here by the bus driver." The children looked at each other. The girl with the scraped elbow, I'd learned her name was Jessamine Colquit. And she was the reason 4 of these 6 were still alive, pointed toward the bathroom. Mr. Pollack put him in there. He said don't open the door. He said Cale needed to be alone until help came. Is he still in there? He stopped making sounds an hour ago. An hour. Griff had quarantined Cale in the bathroom around 3 p.m., then driven the empty bus back to the depot, arriving at 3:47. If Cale had stopped making sounds an hour ago, that meant silence since approximately 3:15, which meant whatever process had taken Griff 3 hours had taken Cale a smaller body, a younger immune system less than 2. I looked at the bathroom door. It was closed. It was not locked from the outside. Bathroom doors don't lock from the outside. It was held shut by a mop handle wedged under the doorknob, a barricade improvised by a bus driver who understood containment, if not epidemiology. The mop handle was bending. Not much, just enough to notice. Just enough to mean that something on the other side was applying slow, patient, continuous pressure, and had been applying it long enough to bow a wooden handle that was never meant to be a lock. "Everybody up," I said. "We're going to the bus, right now. We're going to walk quickly and quietly, and we are not going to look at anything in the front of the store. Eyes on my back. Follow my feet. Go." They went. 6 children unfolded from beneath a desk and followed me through the back door into the fading light. And I led them around the building to the parking lot, where Bus 12 sat with its engine running and Breck Varnell's white-knuckled hands on the wheel. I loaded them on. 10 children now. 6 from the quick stop, 4 from Jessamine Road. Griff's route had 23, 11 still missing. And behind me, inside the quick stop bathroom, the mop handle was still bending, and Cale Dunnigan was still inside. And I was leaving him there because the mop handle was all that stood between a turned child and 10 living ones. And the math I swore I'd never do was the math I was doing right now. I drove south on 71 with 10 children and a silence so heavy it had its own gravity. 2 miles south on Route 71, the road crossed a concrete bridge over Becker Creek, and on the far side of the bridge, I found the rest of them. Not all of them. Not 11. 7. They were in the church. Not the brick church on Schaefer Pike, a different one. A white clapboard Baptist church on a hill overlooking the creek, with a gravel drive and a hand-painted sign that read, "Mount Horeb Fellowship, all welcome." The irony of that sign would not occur to me until later. And when it did, it would hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. I saw the church because I saw the light. Someone had lit candles in the windows, actual candles, tapers and brass holders, the kind churches keep for evening services, and the glow was visible from the road in the deepening twilight. I almost didn't stop. I was driving south, toward town, toward the theoretical safety of infrastructure and authority. But the candles were deliberate. The candles were a signal. Someone inside that church wanted to be found. And the part of me that was still a bus driver, the part that scanned every stop for every face, could not drive past a lit window without checking. I pulled into the gravel lot. There were 2 vehicles, a blue hatchback and a school van, district markings, the kind used by the athletic department for small team transports. I recognized the van. It belonged to Harmon Secondary's coaching staff. The church door opened before I reached it, and a man stepped out holding a baseball bat with the easy grip of someone who knew what a bat was for and had recently expanded his definition. He was mid-30s, fit, wearing a polo shirt with the Harmon Wildcats logo. His name, he told me, was Perry Alnwick, and he was the JV girls softball coach, and he had 7 of Griff's children inside this church. and he had been waiting for someone to come for 3 hours and had begun to consider the possibility that no one was coming at all. "I was at the practice field," Perry said, keeping his voice measured in the way of a man who has been alone with frightened children long enough to learn that his tone is their barometer. "We had late practice. The bus came at the usual time, but Griff, Mr. Pollack, he wasn't right. He was sweating. His hands were shaking on the wheel. He loaded the athletes, and then he just sat there for a minute, staring at the dashboard, and I knocked on the door and asked if he was okay. And he looked at me and said, 'Get the small ones off. Take the small ones off the bus and drive them somewhere quiet.' He said that? Those exact words. The small ones. I didn't understand. I got on the bus and there were kids in the back who were clearly sick. 2 of them. A boy and a girl, both maybe 10 or 11, shivering, noses running. And the other children were pressed against the opposite windows, trying to get as far from them as possible. And Griff said it again. 'Take the small ones.' So I did. I pulled 7 kids off that bus, the youngest ones, the ones sitting closest to the front, and I put them in the school van, and I drove here because it was the nearest building with walls and a lock. 'The 2 sick kids,' I said. 'Did you get their names?' 'The boy was Cale something. I didn't catch the girls.' 'Cale Dunnigan. I know about him. What happened to the rest? After you pulled the 7 off?' Perry's jaw tightened. Griff closed the door and drove away. I could see the other kids' faces in the windows. They were banging on the glass. Some of them, the older ones. He paused. He drove toward the quick stop on 71. I saw him turn in. The timeline was assembling itself in my mind like a jigsaw puzzle dropped from a height, pieces everywhere. But the picture emerging, whether I wanted to see it or not. Griff had recognized the outbreak on his own bus. He'd asked Perry to remove the youngest, healthiest children. Then he'd driven to the quick stop and evacuated the rest, letting the healthy ones scatter, quarantining Cale in the bathroom. Then he'd driven the empty bus back to the depot to signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong. And somewhere on that drive back, the infection had finished what it started. And the man who arrived at the depot was no longer the man who'd left the quick stop. Griff had done everything right. He'd triaged, he'd delegated, he'd contained, he'd signaled. And it hadn't been enough, because the enemy was already inside his bloodstream by the time he made his first decision. And every correct choice he made was made on borrowed time by a body that was already being repossessed. "How many do you have?" Perry asked, looking past me at bus 12. 10. You have 7. That's 17. Griff's road is 23. I know. 6 missing. 6 children unaccounted for between the quick stop and the church, and the houses on Doss Farm Road. 6 children somewhere in the darkening landscape between here and Harmon. Possibly healthy, possibly symptomatic, possibly already past the point where the word child applied. "We need to go," I said. "All of them on the bus. Now." Perry hesitated. "The church has walls. It has a lock. We've been safe here for 3 hours. You've been lucky here for 3 hours. Candles in the windows, Perry. You're a lighthouse. Anything out there that's drawn to light and sound knows exactly where you are." He looked at the windows. The candles flickered in their brass holders, warm and golden and absolutely suicidal in a world where visibility was no longer an asset. I watched the understanding move across his face. The shift from "this is shelter" to "this is a beacon." And he went inside without another word. 2 minutes later, 17 children were on bus 12. Perry Alnwick sat in the back with the bat across his knees. Jessamine Colquit had taken charge of the youngest, arranging them two to a seat with quiet authority. Breck Varnell had moved to the second row and was counting heads with his lips moving silently, doing the same math I was doing. 17 out of 23. 6 still missing. The sun was gone now, just an orange smear on the western horizon, and the sky above was turning the color of a deep bruise. I pulled onto Route 71 and headed south toward Harmon, toward town, toward whatever was left of the infrastructure that was supposed to protect these children when men like me could not. We made it 4 miles before the road became impossible. The bridge over Harmon Creek, the main crossing between the northern county and town, was blocked. Not by debris or by accident, but by intent. Someone had driven 2 18-wheelers nose to nose across the bridge deck, creating a wall of steel and aluminum that no school bus was going to push through. The trucks were dark, engines off, and in the last gray light, I could see that the doors of both cabs were open and the interiors were empty. I stopped bus 1250 yards from the blockade and sat staring at it, while 17 children breathed behind me in a silence that had its own texture, dense, humid, alive with the effort of not asking the question they all wanted to ask. Perry came up the aisle and stood behind my seat. Roadblock? Somebody did this on purpose. Those trucks didn't jackknife. They're parked. Quarantine line? Maybe. Or maybe someone on the other side decided that whatever's happening up here isn't coming south. I looked at him in the mirror. Either way, we're not getting through. The detour options were limited. West was Becker Creek Ravine, no bridges for 8 miles. East was county farmland with a network of gravel roads that eventually connected to Route 9, but Route 9 crossed back over Harmon Creek on a wooden bridge that might or might not support a school bus loaded with 17 children and 2 adults. The math was weight and wood, and the probability that a 40-year-old county bridge had been maintained by a county government that couldn't afford to fill potholes. Mr. Braye? Shiloh Gatterdam's voice from the first seat. Small, clear. There's someone on the bridge. I looked. She was right. A figure had emerged from behind the left-hand truck and was standing in the gap between the 2 cabs, backlit by whatever light source existed on the far side of the blockade. The figure was human-shaped, but its posture was wrong, not the wrongness of Griff's puppet lurch, but a different wrongness. Deliberate, armored, intentional. As my eyes adjusted, I realized the figure was wearing tactical gear. Vest, helmet, something long and angular held across the chest. A voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cracked across the distance. Vehicle, identify yourself. I opened the bus door and leaned out. School bus, bus 12, Harmon Consolidated. I have 17 children on board. Silence. Then the bullhorn again. How many adults? 2. Any passengers showing symptoms? Fever, bleeding, disorientation, aggression? I looked back at the children. 17 faces looking at me. Some pale, some tear-streaked, all exhausted, but all present, all focused, all making eye contact with me in a way that symptomatic people that Griff had not. No symptoms, I called. Another silence, longer this time. I could see movement behind the trucks, more figures, a flashlight beam sweeping. Then the bullhorn. We cannot open the line. Directive from County Emergency Management. The northern corridor is under containment protocol. No vehicle or pedestrian traffic across the Harmon Creek boundary until further notice. Perry grabbed the back of my seat. They're not letting us through? Listen to me, I shouted toward the bridge. I have 17 children, elementary and middle school. They've been out here since 3 o'clock this afternoon. They need water, food, and medical screening. You have to let us through." "Sir, I understand. But the directive is clear. The northern corridor. The northern corridor's full of those things. I've seen them. I've watched a man I've known for a decade turn into one. These children have been walking through it. You want to leave them on this side of your blockade overnight?" The bullhorn clicked off. I could hear muffled conversation between the figures on the bridge, the kind of conversation that happens when the person with the orders meets the person with the conscience, and they discover those are different people. Then a different voice on the bullhorn, older, raspier. "Sir, this is Constable Pettibone, Harmon County Sheriff's Auxiliary. I hear you. I see the bus. But I have orders, and I have 200 people on this side of the creek who are counting on that line holding. If I open it for you, I open it for whatever's behind you." "There is nothing behind me." "You don't know that, and neither do I. That's the problem." I sat back in the driver's seat and looked at the steering wheel and thought about Griff Paulak, who had spent his last conscious hours making decisions that cost him everything. And I thought about how the machinery of safety, the trucks, the blockade, the constable with his bullhorn, was operating exactly as designed. And the design was a wall, and the wall didn't distinguish between the sick and the healthy. The wall only knew sides. "Mr. Braye?" Jessamine Colquitt's voice from the middle of the bus, calm, older than her years. "There's a footpath under the bridge. My dad takes me fishing at Harmon Creek, and we walk under the bridge to get to the good spot. It's shallow there, knee-deep in summer." I looked at her. She looked back at me with the steadiness of a child who has decided that adults are unreliable and has taken over her own logistics. "How wide is the path?" "Wide enough for people, not for the bus." I looked at Perry. He looked at me. Between us, unspoken, the calculation: abandon the bus. Walk 17 children down a creek bank in the dark. Wade through knee-deep water under a bridge guarded by armed men who had orders not to let us through the top. And hope that emerging on the other side, wet and cold and small, would be different enough from driving through in a school bus that the constable's conscience would override his directive. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan. "Everybody off the bus," I said. Quietly. The creek bank was steeper than Jessamine had described, or maybe it only felt that way because I was carrying a 7-year-old on my back, and holding the hand of an 8-year-old, and walking in near total darkness, down a slope of mud and river rock that wanted very badly to send all 3 of us into the water, head first. Perry went first with the bat and a flashlight he'd found in the church, a cheap plastic thing that threw a beam about as wide as a pencil and about as useful. Jessamine walked beside him, navigating by memory, pointing left and right as the path narrowed and widened. Behind them came the children in a line, hand to hand, the older ones shepherding the younger. Breck Varnell at the rear doing his silent head count over and over like a rosary. The night had settled fully now. No moon, overcast, the clouds low and gray and featureless, reflecting a faint orange glow from somewhere south that might have been Harmon streetlights or might have been Harmon on fire. The creek was audible before it was visible, a low, continuous murmur that sounded like conversation heard through a wall, intimate and indecipherable. We reached the water's edge, and Jessamine was right. It was shallow here, maybe knee-deep on an adult, waist-deep on the smaller children. The creek bed was gravel and smooth stone, and the water was cold enough to make the children gasp, but not cold enough to be dangerous. I waded in first, feeling the current against my shins, testing each step before committing my weight. The water was clear and dark, and it moved with the unhurried confidence of a thing that has been doing this exact motion for 10,000 years and sees no reason to stop. The bridge loomed above us, a concrete span maybe 40 feet overhead. And in the shadow beneath it, the world reduced to sound. Water, breathing, the scrape of small shoes on wet rock. I could hear the voices of the men on the bridge, Constable Pettibone and his people, their radios crackling with transmissions I couldn't make out, their boots pacing on the deck above in patterns that suggested anxiety rather than vigilance. We crossed in 2 groups. Perry took the first 9, moving slowly, keeping the children between him and the near bank where the water was shallowest. I took the remaining 8, including Shiloh on my back and the silent crying boy, whose name, I'd learned, was Tolliver Keach, and who had not spoken a single word since I'd found him on Jessamine Road, but who gripped my hand with a ferocity that said everything his mouth would not. The far bank was gentler, a gradual slope of sand and grass that led up to a field behind a row of houses. We emerged from the creek, wet, shivering, and invisible. The blockade was 200 yards east, the trucks and the armed men facing north, watching the road, watching for vehicles, watching for the wrong things in the wrong direction, while 17 children and 2 soaking adults climbed out of the creek behind them like something the water had decided to return. We gathered in the field. Perry did a head count. I did a head count. Breck did a head count. 17 children, all present, all breathing, all upright. The number was correct, and the number was also wrong, because it should have been 23, and the 6 it was not were somewhere on the other side of the creek in the dark. "We need to find a building," Perry said. His teeth were chattering. "Get the kids warm and dry." I looked south toward Harmon. The glow was definitely streetlights. I could see individual points of light now. The organized grid of a small town that still had power, still had infrastructure, still had the illusion of normalcy. We were maybe a mile from the nearest neighborhood. "There's a fire station on Elm Avenue," Jessamine said. She'd taken off her shoes and was wringing out her socks with the practical efficiency of a girl who had been managing adults all day and was running low on patience. "My cousin is a volunteer firefighter. Engine 7. It has beds." I looked at her. 11 years old, scraped elbow, dirt on her forehead now mixed with creek water. She'd navigated us under the bridge. She'd identified the fire station. She was, by any reasonable measure, the most competent person in this group. And she was in the 6th grade. "Engine 7, I said. "Lead the way." We walked. 17 children and 2 adults, wet and cold and wordless, moving through the back streets of Harmon in a procession that looked like something between a field trip and a funeral march. The town was quiet, but not empty. I could see lights in windows, hear a television behind a closed door, smell someone's dinner cooking. The ordinary world was still here, operating on the assumption that the extraordinary world was someone else's problem. And the gap between the two felt like the gap between the bridge deck and the water measurable, crossable, but requiring a descent that most people hadn't yet been asked to make. Engine 7 was where Jessamine said it would be. A single-bay volunteer station on Elm Avenue with a red overhead door and a side entrance and a light on inside. The door was unlocked. The bay was empty, the engine was out, Santerina deployed somewhere, which meant the volunteers were out too, which meant the station was ours. I herded 17 children into a fire station and locked the door behind us and leaned against it and closed my eyes and breathed for the first time in what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. And behind my eyelids, I saw the route Griff's route, my route, the route I'd been driving in reverse all afternoon. And I saw the 6 empty seats, and I opened my eyes, because keeping them closed meant seeing what might be happening to those children right now. And I couldn't carry that and carry the 17 at the same time. Perry found blankets. Jessamine found the kitchen. Breck Varnell stood at the window, watching the street, counting headlights, his lips still moving. The fire station had a bunk room with 4 cots and a supply closet with emergency blankets, and a kitchen with a working stove and running water. Jessamine boiled water for tea with the calm efficiency of someone who had decided that if no adults were going to function properly, she would fill the gap herself. She found instant oatmeal packets in a cabinet and distributed them to the younger children without being asked. And I watched her work and felt a complicated shame, not for anything I'd done, but for the fact that an 11-year-old was performing the emotional labor that should have been mine. I pulled myself together. Not all the way was a luxury that belonged to a world that still existed on the other side of this night, but enough to function, enough to take inventory, enough to count. 17 children, 2 adults, 1 fire station with walls and a lock and a working stove, blankets, water, food for maybe 12 hours, a landline phone on the wall that I picked it up, held it to my ear, and heard a dial tone so pure and ordinary that I nearly laughed. A working phone, a thread connecting this station to the rest of the world, thin and fragile and humming with possibility. I dialed 911. It rang 9 times and connected to a recording. All emergency services in Harmon County are currently engaged. If you are experiencing a life-threatening emergency, shelter in place and await assistance. Do not approach individuals displaying symptoms of infection. Do not attempt to cross quarantine boundaries. The recording looped. I listened to it twice, parsing the words for information. Quarantine boundaries, plural, which meant the bridge blockade wasn't unique. Individuals displaying symptoms, which meant the authorities knew what was happening, even if they hadn't named it. Shelter in place, which meant they had no capacity to come get us and were hoping the walls would do what the government could not. I hung up and dialed Patrice Dunigan's number. She'd given it to me on Doss Farm Road, recited it twice so I wouldn't forget, the way a mother recites the number that represents her last connection to news of her child. It rang 4 times and she answered. "Patrice, it's Colton Braye, the bus driver. Did you find him?" No preamble, no hello, just the question that had been running on a loop in her head since I'd driven away. I looked at the ceiling. I looked at the bunk room door, behind which Tolliver Keach was finally sleeping, and Shiloh Gatterdam was not sleeping, but was lying still with her eyes open, staring at the underside of the bunk above her with the expression of someone replaying a day that would take years to fully process. "I found 17 children," I said. "Cale isn't with them." Silence. The kind of silence that has mass and temperature. "He was at the quick stop on Route 71, I continued. "Griff put him in the bathroom. He was symptomatic, Patrice. Griff was trying to contain it." "Is he still there?" "I don't know. I couldn't. The door was under pressure. Something was pushing against it from inside. I had 10 children with me, and I made the decision to leave." "You left my son in a gas station bathroom." The sentence landed like a physical blow. Not because it was unfair, it was completely fair. It was the most accurate description of what I had done. But because hearing it spoken aloud by his mother gave it a weight that my internal justification had been working very hard to keep suspended. "Yes," I said. "I did." "Then I'm going to get him." "Patrice, I'm in my car. The Gatterdam woman is with me. She wants her daughter. We're on Doss Farm Road, and I'm going to get in my car and drive to the quick stop and get my son out of that bathroom." The quick stop is compromised. There are bodies inside. The road north is. He is 12 years old, and he is locked in a bathroom, and you left him there. I know. Tell me where it is, exactly. I told her. Route 71, northbound, 4 miles past the Harmon Creek Bridge. But the bridge was blockaded. She'd have to go east on County Line 9 and come around through the Schaefer Pike Junction, adding 20 minutes and taking her through the same landscape. I'd just driven through in reverse. I told her all of this, and she listened without interrupting. And I could hear her car starting in the background, the engine catching with the determination of a mother whose mathematics were different from mine, not better, not worse, but calibrated to a different variable. My equation had 17 on one side and 1 on the other. Her equation had 1 on both sides, and the one was named Kale. Patrice, take the Gatterdam woman to the bridge. Constable Pettibone is there. He'll let civilians through on foot. He's holding vehicles, not people. Send Mrs. Gatterdam across the creek. We're at the fire station on Elm Avenue. Engine 7. Shiloh is here. She's safe. And then I go north. It wasn't a question. I recognized the tone because I'd used it myself, standing in the depot lot 6 hours earlier, saying, "I'm going to find him," to a woman with a kitchen knife. The tone of a person who is chosen and cannot be unchosen. "Be careful," I said, which was the most useless sentence in the English language and the only one I had. She hung up. I set the phone in its cradle and stood in the kitchen of Engine 7 and listened to the oatmeal water cooling on the stove and the sound of 17 children breathing in various stages of sleep and wakefulness. And I thought about Cale Doonigan in the dark of a gas station bathroom, pressing against a door that a mop handle was never meant to hold. And I thought about what it meant to be the man who made the right decision and the wrong decision at the same time. And whether there was a word for that, and whether the word was just human. Perry Alnwick appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd dried off and changed into a firefighter's spare shirt from the locker room. And he looked less like a softball coach and more like a man who had been conscripted into a war he hadn't enlisted for. "The kids are settling," he said. "Jessamine has them organized. She's something. She's 11. She's the reason half of them are alive." I nodded. He was right. Whatever instinct had guided Jessamine Colquitt through this day, from the quick-stop back room to the creek crossing to the fire station kitchen, it was an instinct that didn't have a name in the curriculum, didn't appear on any report card, didn't map to any competency framework devised by the adults who were supposed to be in charge. Midnight came without announcement. The fire station clock ticked through it. 11:59, 12 o'clock, 12:01. And the night continued as if the change of date was a bureaucratic formality that had no bearing on the actual business of darkness. Most of the children were asleep. Perry had organized a watch rotation, him at midnight, me at 2, Breck Varnell at 4. Though I'd privately decided I wasn't going to let a 14-year-old stand watch alone, regardless of his willingness. Jessamine had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, with her head on her arms, and her scraped elbow crusted with dried blood that nobody had gotten around to cleaning. And I covered her with a blanket and felt the specific tenderness of protecting a child who had spent the day protecting others. I sat by the window with the landline phone in my lap, and the station's emergency radio on the desk beside me. The radio was picking up county emergency frequencies, fragmented transmissions, partial call signs, the clipped language of people managing a crisis that had outgrown their training and their equipment. From what I could piece together, the situation was this. The infection had appeared simultaneously in at least 4 locations across Harmon County: the school, the industrial park south of town, the county hospital, and a church gathering on the west side. It spread through close contact and bodily fluids, but also, possibly, through airborne transmission in enclosed spaces, which explained why Griff's bus had become an incubator and why the school had been one of the primary vectors. The incubation period ranged from 90 minutes to 6 hours, depending on factors no one had identified yet. The turning, I kept using that word because the radio operators used it, because it was more precise than infection and less clinical than reanimation, was preceded by fever, bleeding from the gums, and a progressive loss of higher cognitive function followed by a cascade failure of the autonomic nervous system, after which the body continued to operate under the direction of something that was not the original occupant. The turned were drawn to sound and movement. They were not fast, not faster than a healthy adult at a run, but they were persistent, and they did not tire, and they did not stop, and their numbers were growing at a rate that the county's emergency services could not match. Harmon was under a soft quarantine. The bridge blockade was one of 4. The National Guard had been requested, but had not arrived. The nearest military installation was 90 miles east and was reportedly dealing with its own outbreak. The word outbreak appeared in every third transmission. The word contained appeared in none. I set the radio down and looked out the window. Elm Avenue was empty. The streetlights were on. The grid was still functioning. The power plant south of town, still staffed and operational, and their light fell on a street that could have been any street on any night in any small town in America. Parked cars, mowed lawns, a cat walking along a fence with the entitled indifference of a creature that had not yet recognized the change in the food chain. At 1:17 a.m., the phone rang. The sound was so ordinary and so violent in the silence that I jerked and nearly dropped the receiver. I grabbed it on the second ring. Engine 7. Colton. Patrice Donegan's voice, breathless. I'm at the quick stop. I closed my eyes. Did you find him? The bathroom door is open. The mop handle is broken. He's not inside. Patrice. The bathroom is empty. There's blood on the sink and there's blood, but he's not here. The front of the store I can see what's in the front of the store, but Cale is not there either. He got out. He must have pushed him through the door, and he got out, and he went somewhere. Or, don't. Her voice was a blade. Don't say it. He's 12. He's strong. He was a wrestler, did I tell you that? 58 pounds soaking wet, and he pinned a boy 20 pounds heavier at regionals. He's strong, and he's smart, and he got out of that bathroom, and he's somewhere, and I'm going to find him. I pressed my palm against my forehead. The specific agony of this conversation, a mother on the phone at 1 a.m., standing in a gas station that smelled like death, narrating the absence of her child to a man who had left him there, was unlike anything I had navigated before. My training was in routes and schedules and the orderly transfer of children from point A to point B. My training did not include this frequency of grief. Which direction? I asked. Is there a trail? Footprints? The back door is open. The cinder block is knocked over. He went out the back. What's behind the quick stop? Field, soybeans. It goes for, I don't know, a mile? To the tree line. A 12-year-old boy, turned or turning, pushing through a door and stumbling into a soybean field in the dark. If he was turned, he was operating on stimulus and momentum, moving toward whatever sound or light pulled him. If he was still himself, still Cale, still the 58-pound wrestler who pinned bigger boys, then he was running, sick and scared, toward whatever direction felt like away. The tree line, I said. Becker Creek runs along the tree line. If he made it to the creek, he might have followed it south. The water would have the sound of the water, the coolness. A child would follow that. Then I'm going south along the creek. Patrice, it's pitch dark, and you're alone. I have a flashlight. I have the knife. A kitchen knife and a flashlight against the dark. A mother's arsenal, laughable in any tactical assessment, sufficient in the only assessment that mattered, the assessment of will. Call me, I said, every 30 minutes. If you don't call, I'm coming north. Don't leave those children. Then call me every 30 minutes. She agreed and hung up, and I sat in the fire station holding a dead receiver and listening to the clock tick and the children breathe and the radio murmur its litany of numbers and codes. And I understood, not intellectually but viscerally, in my bones, in the part of me that was still a man, who showed up and did the route that I had made a choice on the road to save 17 at the cost of not saving one. And that choice had consequences that were still unfolding, and that the unfolding might not stop for a very long time. Patrice called at 1:47. Nothing. The field was empty. She was at the tree line. She called at 2:15. She'd found a shoe, a sneaker, size 6, in the mud at the creek's edge. Kale's. She recognized the custom lacing pattern he used for wrestling practice, a figure-8 thread that his coach had taught him for ankle support. She called at 2:48. She was following the creek south. She'd heard something in the trees, a rustling that could have been deer or wind or a 12-year-old boy moving through underbrush, and she'd called out his name and the rustling had stopped. At 3:20, she didn't call. I waited 5 minutes, then 10. At 3:35, I dialed her cell. It rang once and went to voicemail, a cheerful recording, Patrice's daytime voice. The voice of a woman who answered phones, in a world where phones were for scheduling and small talk and not for tracking the disappearance of everything you'd built your life around. Perry was awake. He'd been listening to my half of the conversations, filling in the gaps with the accuracy of a man who understood narrative structure even if his experience was in coaching rather than crisis management. Go, he said. The children. I've got them, Jessamine and I. We'll hold the station, take the bus. The bus is on the other side of the creek. Then take a car. There are keys on the pegboard. The volunteers leave personal vehicles here. Take one. I looked at the pegboard by the door. 3 sets of keys, labeled with masking tape. Wiltz, Corvo, Fiam. I took the set labeled Corvo because it was a truck key, and a truck felt more appropriate than whatever Wiltz or Fam drove for the night I was about to have. The Corvo truck was a dark green Ford with a dented tailgate and a toolbox bolted to the bed and a half-full tank of gas. I started it and pulled onto Elm Avenue and headed north, toward the creek, toward the county roads, toward the dark corridor that I'd driven through once already and was now driving through again, because a woman hadn't called when she said she would, and a boy was missing, and the route Griff's route, my route, the only route, was not finished. The bridge blockade was still manned. I could see the flashlight beams as I approached, and I slowed and rolled down the window, and before I could speak, Constable Pettibone's voice came from behind one of the trucks. "That's you, bus driver?" "It's me." The mother came through 2 hours ago, in a silver Camry. I let her through because she was going anyway, and I'd rather open the line than have her go around. She stopped calling. A pause. Then Pettibone stepped into the headlights. He was older than I'd imagined, late 60s, weathered, the face of a man who had spent 40 years enforcing low-level municipal law and was now standing at the boundary of something that hadn't been in any training manual. He was holding his bullhorn in one hand and a shotgun in the other, and he looked tired in a way that went past sleep and into the territory of spiritual exhaustion. "I'll open the line," he said. "One vehicle, in and out. You've got until dawn." He signaled, and one of the trucks reversed just enough to create a gap. I drove through, and the truck closed behind me, and I was back in the northern corridor, back in the dark, back in the landscape, where Griff Paulak had driven his route for the last time, and the world had rearranged itself around the absence of 23 children. Route 71 was empty. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating asphalt and shoulder gravel and the occasional reflective marker on a signpost, and nothing else. No other vehicles, no pedestrians, no shapes at the roadside that might have been people or might have been things that had been people. The emptiness was its own kind of horror, not the presence of danger, but the removal of context. The stripping away of every landmark and reference point that told you where you were in the story of your own life. I reached the quick stop at 4:10 a.m. Patrice's Camry was in the lot, driver's door open, headlights on, engine still running. The fuel gauge, visible through the open door, showed a quarter tank. She'd left in a hurry. She'd left toward something. I parked beside the Camry and got out and stood in the lot and listened. The quick stop was dark now. The fluorescents had gone off, either on a timer or because the power had been cut, and the only light was the truck's headlights, and the Camry's headlights, creating overlapping cones of white that made the darkness beyond them seem absolute and intentional. Then I heard it. From the south, from the creek. A voice, not a scream, not a moan, but something between. A human voice calling a human name over and over, with the cadence of prayer. Cale, Cale, Cale. Patrice was alive. Patrice was in the creek bed, south of the quick stop, still looking, still calling. And the reason she hadn't phoned was either because her phone was dead, or her hands were occupied, or she had found something that made calling me irrelevant. I grabbed the flashlight from the truck's glove compartment and ran. The creek bed was a different world at 4 in the morning. The water was black and silver where the flashlight touched it, and the banks were curtained with undergrowth that closed overhead in places, creating tunnels of vegetation that smelled like mud and green and the mineral tang of water moving over stone. I followed Patrice's voice south, climbing over roots and slipping on wet rock. And the voice grew louder, but didn't change the same word, the same rhythm, the same tone that had moved past desperation into something more durable and less kind. I found her a quarter-mile downstream, standing knee-deep in the creek at a point where the bank had collapsed into a mudslide, creating a shelf of raw earth that jutted over the water like a crude awning. She was facing the shelf. Her flashlight was pointed at the space beneath it, a hollow, maybe 4 feet deep and 2 feet high, where the roots of a fallen oak created a lattice of wood and shadow. Cale Dunnigan was inside. He was curled on his side, wedged into the space between the roots and the earth, and he was shaking. Not the convulsive shaking of the turned, not the mechanical, wrong-footed lurch I'd seen in Griff, but the deep, full-body tremor of a child with a high fever and no medication and 8 hours of exposure. His eyes were closed. His face was streaked with mud and dried blood from his gums, and his breathing was rapid and shallow. And his skin in the flashlight beam was the color of old paper. "He's here," Patrice said without turning around. "He's here, and he's alive. And I don't know if alive is the right word anymore." I came up beside her and looked at the boy. 12 years old, 58 pounds. The figure 8 lacing on his remaining sneaker. He'd lost the other, the one Patrice found upstream. His hands were clenched into fists even in unconsciousness, and his jaw was locked, and I could see the muscles in his neck standing out like cables as his body fought whatever was happening inside it. Has he spoken? Once, 20 minutes ago. He said, "Mom," and then he said something else, I couldn't understand. And then he closed his eyes and hasn't opened them since. I crouched at the edge of the hollow. Cale, can you hear me? My name is Colton. I drive the school bus. Your mom is here. We're going to get you out. Nothing. The shaking continued. His breathing hitched, caught, resumed. Patrice was watching my face with the precision of a woman who had been a nurse. I realized now that the scrub top wasn't a fashion choice. It was a uniform, and the way she was reading Cale's symptoms was clinical, professional, informed by training I didn't have. What do you see? I asked her. Fever over 104, probably closer to 106. Gingival hemorrhaging. That's the bleeding gums. Tachycardia. Muscle rigidity. He's dehydrated. He's been out here for 10 hours? 12? She paused. In the people I've seen turn, the final stage is loss of consciousness, followed by a period of apparent death. No respiration, no visible pulse, lasting anywhere from 1 to 15 minutes. After that, they restart. But they're not the same thing that stopped. How long between loss of consciousness and the restart? I don't know. The Hartzell woman took about 10 minutes. Griff, I don't know. I didn't see Griff. Is Cale in that stage? He's on the edge. He's still fighting it. His body is still running a fever, which means his immune system is still active, which means the takeover isn't complete. But the shaking, the rigidity, that's the infection taking motor control. It's happening in stages. I looked at the boy wedged into the roots and the mud. He had fled the bathroom. He had pushed through a mop-handle barricade while partially turned. And instead of lurching into the gas station to find prey, he had gone out the back door and across a soybean field and down a creek bank and crawled into a hole in the earth. A turned person wouldn't do that. A turned person moves toward stimulus, not away from it. Cale had moved away from everything, away from buildings, away from roads, away from people. Cale had hidden, because Cale was still in there. Behind the fever and the bleeding gums and the motor control cascade, the 12-year-old wrestler was still making decisions. And the decision he'd made was to isolate himself, to remove himself from the proximity of other humans, to protect other people from what he was becoming. The same decision Griff had made when he told Perry to take the small ones off the bus. The same instinct. I am dangerous now. Get away from me. He hid on purpose, I said. Patrice's face crumpled. Not into grief, past grief, into a territory of emotion that didn't have a name. The territory where a mother understands that her child is still her child, even as he stops being himself, and that his last conscious act was to protect strangers from himself. We have to get him out of there, she said. And take him where? The hospital, Harmon General. The hospital is in the quarantine zone. The radio said it was one of the primary outbreak sites. Then somewhere with medical equipment, an urgent care, a vet clinic, anywhere with an IV line and antipyretics and monitoring. If his fever breaks, if we can bring his temperature down, maybe the immune system can. Patrice, don't tell me there's nothing we can do. Don't you dare tell me that. I didn't tell her that. I didn't tell her anything for a moment. I stood in the creek in the dark and listened to the water and the boy's labored breathing and the distant, directionless hum of a county falling apart. And I made a decision that was not about arithmetic and not about the greater good and not about the 17 children in the fire station and not about the 6 still missing. It was about a boy in a hole who had used his last free will to save people he didn't know. And it was about his mother standing in the water with a kitchen knife and a dead flashlight, and the unshakable conviction that love was a medical intervention. "Help me get him out," I said. We extracted Cale from the hollow together, Patrice supporting his head, me pulling his body, both of us working in the mud and the roots with the desperate efficiency of people who have stopped calculating odds and started simply acting. He was lighter than I expected, under 50 pounds now, dehydrated, diminished, and when I lifted him against my chest, his head fell against my shoulder and his fists unclenched for the first time, and his fingers opened and closed once around the collar of my shirt. And I chose to believe that was Cale, still there, still holding on. We carried him up the bank and across the field to the quick stop lot. I put him in the back seat of Patrice's Camry, and Patrice climbed in beside him and cradled his head in her lap and said, "Drive." I drove. The veterinary clinic on Schaefer Pike was a long shot, but Patrice said the vet, Dr. Mariah Callender, was a friend, and the clinic had IV equipment and temperature monitoring, and a surgical bay that could serve as an isolation room if isolation became necessary. The fact that it was designed for livestock and house pets rather than human patients was a distinction that had lost its meaning somewhere between the creek bed and the Camry's back seat. I drove east on Route 71, then south on Schaefer, retracing the route I'd driven hours earlier in the school bus. The night was beginning to soften at its edges, not dawn yet, but the prelude to dawn, a faint dilution of the blackness along the eastern horizon that said time was still passing, even if it felt like it had stopped. The vet clinic was dark but intact. The front door was locked. I broke a window, a side window. Single pane, the glass giving way with a sound that felt both transgressive and trivially appropriate, like jaywalking during an earthquake. Inside, the clinic smelled like antiseptic and pet food and the particular sterility of a place designed for the management of bodies. I found the exam room. Patrice directed me to the stainless steel table. Put him down gently, support his neck. And she moved through the clinic with the focused authority of a woman whose professional training had finally found its context. She found an IV setup designed for large dogs and adapted it with the improvisation of battlefield medicine. Saline bag, pediatric drip rate estimated by weight, tourniquet fashioned from a rubber strip meant for restraining animal patients. Cale's arm was so thin the needle went in easily. The saline began its slow descent, and I watched the drip, drip, drip with the irrational hope that hydration could fight what was happening inside him. "Fever's holding," Patrice said, her hand on his forehead. "Maybe dropping. I can't tell without a thermometer." She looked around the room. "There, digital rectal for cats. It'll work." It read 104.2. High, dangerous, but not the 106 she'd estimated at the creek. The shaking had diminished to a tremor, and his breathing had slowed to something closer to sleep than crisis. And the rigidity in his muscles, the infection's claim on his motor system, had softened enough that his body looked like a boy's body again, rather than a mechanism caught between two operators. "Is he coming back?" I asked. Patrice didn't answer immediately. She was watching his eyes behind closed lids, the rapid scanning movement I'd seen in Griff's blown pupils, but slower now, less mechanical, more like the eye movement of a dreaming child. "I don't know," she said. The others who turned, they didn't have this. They didn't have the transition period. They went from symptomatic to gone in under an hour. Cale has been fighting for over 12 hours. Either his body is losing slowly or it's winning slowly. And the difference between those two things looks exactly the same from the outside. I sat on the floor of the veterinary clinic with my back against the wall and my knees drawn up and my hands on my face. And I felt the full weight of the day settle onto me, like a physical substance, not exhaustion, exactly, but something denser. The weight of roots, the weight of counting, the weight of every seat on a school bus being a name, and every name being a family, and every family being a universe of grief that could be created or prevented by the decision of a man who drove a bus for a living and had never, not once in 11 years, been asked to decide anything more consequential than whether to wait 30 seconds for a late child at a stop. The other 6, I said. The 6 I couldn't find. Patrice looked at me. You found 17. 6 are still out there. Colton, you found 17 children in 5 hours with a school bus and no plan. You crossed a quarantine line. You walked them through a creek in the dark. You're sitting in a veterinary clinic at 5 a.m. holding an IV line for a boy you left behind and came back for. The 6 are on the radio's conscience, the county's, the system's, not yours. I drove the route. The route has 23 seats, and 17 of them are full. My son is alive. You came back for him. I left him first. Yes, and then you came back. That's not failure. That's a route with 2 stops. I looked at her, a woman I'd met 7 hours ago in a driveway with a kitchen knife. A nurse in a scrub top. A mother whose son was balanced on the edge of something that might be recovery and might be extinction. And I heard in her words something I hadn't expected and didn't deserve. Absolution. Not forgiveness, exactly. Absolution. The distinction mattered. Forgiveness requires a wrong. Absolution requires a weight. She wasn't forgiving me for leaving Cale. She was telling me that the weight of the 6 was not mine to carry alone, and that carrying 17 was not a lesser act, because 23 was the full count. At 5:47 a.m., Cale opened his eyes. Not the scanning, mechanical eyes of the turned. Human eyes. Brown eyes, focused, tracking, finding his mother's face and locking onto it with the specific intensity of a child waking from a nightmare and needing to confirm that the waking world still contains the person who matters most. Mom? Patrice made a sound that I will not describe because some sounds belong only to the people who make them and the people who cause them. And this sound was Patrice Dunnigan's alone. I'm here, baby. I didn't hurt anyone. I made sure. I went to the creek. I went away from the road. I know you did. His hand found hers, and his fingers closed around it. Not the grasping clutch of a fever patient, but the deliberate grip of a boy who had made a choice and survived it, and needed to feel the solid fact of his mother's hand to believe it was over. His temperature at 6:15 a.m. was 101.4, dropping. I walked outside. The sun was rising. The sky was the color of a healing bruise, purple and pink and gold at the edges, and the air smelled like dew and cut grass and the ordinary morning of a world that had not entirely ended. I drove back to Engine 7 at sunrise. Perry met me at the door with a face that told me everything before his mouth did. All 17, present, accounted for, sleeping or waking or eating the last of the instant oatmeal. Jessamine Colquitt had organized a cleaning detail, and the fire station bunkroom was tidier than it had been when we arrived. Breck Varnell was at the window where he'd been all night, but his lips had stopped moving. The count was settled. The count was 17. I told Perry about Cale. His face did something complex: relief, wonder, the specific expression of a man who has spent the night preparing himself for the worst and is now being asked to metabolize the merely bad. Cale was alive. Cale's fever was dropping. Whether Cale would be fully Cale again, whether the infection left wreckage even when it receded, was a question that belonged to doctors and time, and not to a bus driver standing in a fire station kitchen at 6:30 in the morning. The radio had news. The National Guard had reached the county line overnight and was staging at the fairgrounds south of town. Medical teams were being deployed to quarantine boundaries. The bridge blockade was being converted from a wall into a checkpoint, Constable Pettibone's conscience, or his orders. Having evolved from exclusion to processing, families were gathering at the high school gymnasium, which had been designated as a reunification center. And the word reunification on the radio hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for, because it was a word that meant the system still believed in putting things back together. I loaded 17 children on the Corvo truck bed and cab, packed tight, holding on, and drove south through Harmon to the high school. The streets were different in daylight. Evidence of the night was everywhere. An overturned trash can, a car with its windshield starred by impact, a front door hanging open on a house where the lights were still on. But there were also people. Real people. Upright people. People walking dogs and checking on neighbors and standing in driveways with coffee cups, looking around with the bewildered alertness of a population that had survived something it didn't yet have a name for. The gymnasium was chaos and order in equal measure. National Guard personnel at the entrance, checking names against school rosters. Parents behind a rope line, faces tight with a hope so fierce it looked like anger. I pulled up, and the children climbed out of the truck, and I watched 17 reunions happen in 90 seconds, each one a specific detonation of relief. A mother grabbing a child and going to her knees. A father holding a son at arm's length to look at him, and then pulling him in so hard the boy's feet left the ground. Shiloh Gatterdam's mother, the woman from Doss Farm Road, the one I'd sent Patrice to fetch, was there. She had crossed the creek on foot as I'd instructed, and she'd been at the gymnasium since midnight, waiting. She collected Shiloh the way you collect something precious that has been held by strangers gently, thoroughly, with the implicit message that letting go would not be happening again for some time. Breck Varnell's parents were there. Jessamine Colquitt's father was there, a large, quiet man who looked at his daughter with an expression that suggested he understood, more than anyone else in the room, exactly what she had done and exactly what it had cost her to do it. Tolliver Keach's grandmother was there. She was the one who told me his name. I'd never heard him say it himself. "Tolliver doesn't speak," she said, as if this were a permanent condition rather than a response to trauma. "He hasn't spoken since his mother passed last year." She took his hand and he went with her. And at the door, he looked back at me. And I saw in his eyes something that I will carry forward through whatever comes next. Recognition. Not gratitude, that's too simple a word. Recognition. I see you. You were there. You showed up. Perry Alnwick shook my hand. "You're a bus driver," he said. And the way he said it made it sound like a title, like a rank, like something earned rather than assigned. "I'm a bus driver," I agreed. I drove the Corvo truck back to the fire station. I parked it in the lot where I'd found it. I hung the keys on the pegboard. I walked to the bridge, now open, now manned by National Guard soldiers who checked my ID and let me through. I walked north along Route 71 in the morning sun, 2 miles to the quick stop, where Bus 12 was still parked at the edge of the lot with its engine off and its door open and its seats empty. 23 seats. I walked the aisle. I touched each one, the green vinyl, the metal frames, the small graffiti scratched into the backs by years of children's fingernails. Each seat a name, each name a stop, each stop a moment when a door opened and a child climbed aboard and trusted that the person behind the wheel would take them where they needed to go. I sat in the driver's seat. I pulled the door shut. I started the engine. And I drove Bus 12 back to the depot, completing the route that Griff Paulak had started and could not finish. Because the route is the route. And the route is a promise. And some promises are kept not because you are brave, but because you are the one who showed up. They found 4 of the missing 6 the next day, scattered across the northern corridor, sheltering in a barn, a drainage culvert, a locked car, a stranger's basement. Frightened, dehydrated, but alive. The other 2, the Thurman twins, age 9, were found on the 3rd day, together, in a deer blind on the edge of the Becker Creek ravine. They'd climbed up the ladder and pulled it after them, 10 feet off the ground, and waited in the dark for 2 nights with a water bottle and each other. They were fine. They were silent the way Tolliver was silent. But they were fine. And their mother's sound when she saw them was the sound Patrice Dunnigan had made when Cale opened his eyes, the sound I will not describe because it does not belong to me. Cale Dunnigan's fever broke fully on the 2nd day. He spent a week in the gymnasium medical tent and walked out under his own power, thinner, quieter, different. Whether the infection left marks that don't show on skin is a question that will take years to answer. His mother walks beside him now with the attentiveness of a woman who has renegotiated her understanding of proximity, of distance, of how far is too far to let your child go. I still drive bus 12. The depot was cleaned, repaired, reopened. The route was reassigned. The new driver covers Griff's corridor now. A young woman named Amaris Okafor, who does not yet understand why I insist on checking every seat after every run. Why I memorize every name. Why I wait at every stop for the count to match the list before I close the door and pull away. Griff Pollack is gone. I say gone because the alternative words are inadequate. He did his job until his body was no longer his. He carried the sick child to shelter. He told a coach to save the small ones. He drove the bus home. If there is a better definition of the word enough, I have not found it. I am a man who drives a bus. I show up. I do the route. I bring them home. That is the whole of it.